Picture this. You wake up in the morning, and instead of checking your phone or grabbing a coffee, you're immediately hit with the smell of human waste flowing through the streets outside your window. Your stomach is already cramping from hunger because you haven't had a proper meal in days. And even if you could afford food, there's a good chance it's spoiled or contaminated. You step outside, and half the people you knew last month are simply gone. Not moved away, not traveling, dead. Welcome to the 14th century, arguably the worst time in human history to draw breath on this planet. Tonight we're exploring one of history's most fascinating yet challenging periods. If you find these historical deep dives helpful or entertaining, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing, as it helps the channel more than you know. We're going to take a journey back to what many historians consider the absolute worst century to be alive in all of human history, the 14th century. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's explore together why this particular century stands out as uniquely difficult in the long story of humanity. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely there have been worse times, right? What about the Holocaust, or the atomic bombs, or the trenches of World War I? These were undoubtedly horrific periods, but they were relatively short-lived and geographically contained. The 14th century was different. It was a century-long nightmare that affected virtually every corner of the known world, combining multiple catastrophes into one perfect storm of human misery that lasted for generations. Let's start with the big one, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa like a wildfire through dry grass. But calling it just the plague doesn't really capture the sheer scale of devastation we're talking about. This wasn't just a disease, it was an apocalypse. Conservative estimates suggest that 1/3 of Europe's population died. That's roughly 25 million people. Some regions lost up to 60% of their population. Imagine if tomorrow, every third person you know simply vanished forever. The plague didn't discriminate. It killed peasants and kings, priests and merchants, children and adults with equal enthusiasm. The symptoms were absolutely horrific. Victims developed painful swellings called buboes in their lymph nodes, often as large as apples. These would ooze blood and pus. People would develop dark spots on their skin as blood vessels burst beneath the surface. Many victims would die within days of showing symptoms, often in agony, sometimes bleeding from every orifice. The lucky ones died quickly, but the physical horror was just the beginning. The psychological trauma of watching society collapse around you was equally devastating. Imagine being a parent watching your children die one by one, powerless to help them. Imagine being a child watching your parents waste away while you wonder if you're next. The normal rhythms of life, work, trade, education, even basic social interaction, ground to a halt as entire communities were wiped out or abandoned. The economic consequences were staggering. With so many people dead, there weren't enough workers to maintain the feudal system that had defined European society for centuries. Fields went unharvested, leading to famine even after the plague subsided. Trade routes collapsed as merchant cities were decimated. The few survivors often found themselves inheriting property and wealth from multiple dead relatives. But what good is wealth when there's nothing to buy and no one to buy it from? Religious faith, which had been the cornerstone of medieval life, was shaken to its core. People had been told that God was just and merciful, that prayer and devotion would protect them. Yet the plague seemed to strike the devout just as readily as the sinful. Some turned to extreme religious practices, like the flagellants, who would whip themselves bloody in public processions, believing that by punishing themselves they could appease God's wrath. Others lost faith entirely, leading to a breakdown in the moral fabric of society. But even if you somehow managed to avoid the plague, the 14th century had plenty of other ways to make your life miserable. Let's talk about the climate. The century began during what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that lasted from roughly 1300 to 1850. This might sound pleasant if you're thinking about escaping modern global warming, but the reality was devastating for medieval agriculture. The cooling climate meant shorter growing seasons and more unpredictable weather. Crops that had reliably grown for centuries suddenly began failing. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was a direct result of this climate change. For 7 years, Europe was gripped by the worst famine in recorded history up to that point. People literally starved to death in the streets. In some areas, reports suggest people resorted to cannibalism to survive. Parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. The social order broke down as desperate people fought over scraps of moldy bread. During the famine, a pound of salt, something we take completely for granted today, cost as much as a cow had cost in normal times. People would eat bark, grass, even dirt mixed with small amounts of flour to try to fill their stomachs. The wealthy might have fared slightly better, but even they faced severe shortages. This wasn't a brief period of hardship. It was 7 years of watching your neighbors, your family, your community slowly waste away from hunger. The agricultural crisis created a cascade of problems. Malnutrition weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to disease, which is part of why the Black Death was so devastating when it arrived a few decades later. The famine also disrupted trade and commerce, leading to economic instability that would plague the century. Social tensions rose as people competed for increasingly scarce resources. Speaking of social tensions, the 14th century was also marked by almost constant warfare. The 100 Years' War between England and France began in 1337 and would drag on until 1453. But the 14th century saw some of its most brutal phases. This wasn't the romanticized version of medieval warfare you might see in movies, with noble knights engaging in honorable combat. This was dirty, brutal warfare that devastated entire regions. The development of new military technologies made warfare more deadly than ever before. The English longbow could pierce armor at distances that made traditional heavy cavalry obsolete. Cannons began appearing on battlefields, bringing gunpowder warfare to Europe for the first time. But perhaps most importantly, armies began relying heavily on mercenaries, professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than loyalty to a lord or cause. These mercenary companies were particularly devastating during peacetime. When there wasn't a war to fight, they would often turn to raiding and pillaging to support themselves. The free companies, as they were known, would descend on villages and towns like locusts, taking everything of value and destroying what they couldn't carry. They had no loyalty to local populations and no investment in the long-term stability of the regions they passed through. The impact on civilians was catastrophic. Peasants might work for years to build up a small surplus of grain or livestock, only to have it all seized by a passing army in a single day. Women faced the constant threat of rape and violence. Children were sometimes taken as slaves. Entire villages would be burned to the ground, their populations scattered or killed. Even if you lived in a city, you weren't safe. Medieval siege warfare was a prolonged nightmare for those trapped inside city walls. Sieges could last for months, during which food supplies would dwindle and sanitation would break down completely. Attackers would sometimes catapult diseased corpses over city walls in early forms of biological warfare. When cities finally fell, the aftermath was often a massacre, as soldiers, finally released from the restraints of siege discipline, would run amok. The legal system of the 14th century offered little protection for ordinary people. Justice was arbitrary and often brutal. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, and execution methods were designed to maximize suffering as much as to end life. Being drawn and quartered, burned at the stake, or broken on the wheel were all standard punishments. The concept of due process barely existed, and accusations of heresy or witchcraft could lead to horrible deaths based on the flimsiest evidence. For women, the 14th century was particularly harsh. They had virtually no legal rights, couldn't own property in most places, and were considered the property of their fathers or husbands. Marriage was typically arranged for economic or political reasons, with women having no say in the matter. Domestic violence was not only legal, but often encouraged as a way for men to discipline their wives. Rape was considered a crime against a woman's male relatives rather than against the woman herself. Childbirth was a death sentence for many women. Without modern medical knowledge or sanitary conditions, maternal mortality rates were astronomical. Even if a woman survived childbirth, infant mortality was so high that most families expected to lose several children. It was common for women to have 8 or 10 children in hopes that 2 or 3 might survive to adulthood. Medical care, such as it was more likely to kill you than cure you. Doctors believed in the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and thought that disease was caused by imbalances between these substances. Treatment often involved bloodletting, purging, or other procedures that actually weakened patients further. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Many cures involved toxic substances like mercury or lead. The concept of germs and infection was completely unknown. If you fell ill, you might be treated with a mixture of prayer, herbal remedies of questionable value, and medical procedures that were often more harmful than the original illness. Broken bones often healed incorrectly, leaving people permanently disabled. Infections that today would be easily treated with antibiotics were often fatal. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening if they became infected. Dental care was virtually non-existent. By middle age, most people had lost many of their teeth to decay and infection. The pain from dental problems was constant and excruciating, with no effective painkillers available. Some people would have their teeth pulled without anesthesia, but this was often just as dangerous as leaving them in place. The social structure of the 14th century was rigidly hierarchical and offered little hope for social mobility. If you were born a peasant, you would almost certainly die a peasant. The feudal system bound people to the land and to their social class. Serfs were essentially slaves, tied to their lord's estate and unable to leave without permission. They owed heavy labor obligations and had to give a significant portion of their harvest to their lords. Education was limited to a tiny elite. The vast majority of people couldn't read or write. Knowledge was controlled by the church and the nobility. There were no newspapers, no books for common people, no way to learn about the world beyond your immediate surroundings. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, never seeing the wider world or having any understanding of their place in it. The church, which wielded enormous power in medieval society, was often corrupt and oppressive. The sale of indulgences, essentially paying money to reduce time in purgatory, was widespread. Church officials often lived in luxury while preaching poverty to their congregations. The Inquisition used torture and execution to suppress any deviation from orthodox belief. Even private thoughts could be considered heretical if they challenged church doctrine. Daily life for most people was a constant struggle for survival. Homes were typically 1 or 2 rooms shared by entire families, along with their animals. There was no privacy, no sanitation, and no escape from the smell, noise, and chaos of medieval life. People slept on straw mattresses that were infested with lice and other parasites. Bathing was infrequent and often considered unhealthy or morally suspect. Food, when available, was monotonous and often spoiled. The medieval diet consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and occasional vegetables. Meat was a luxury that most people rarely enjoyed. Food preservation techniques were primitive. So much of what people ate was salted, smoked, or pickled to the point of being barely palatable. Malnutrition was common, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and various deficiency diseases. Water was often contaminated, leading to widespread illness. People drank ale or wine not because they enjoyed alcohol, but because the fermentation process made these beverages safer than water. Even so, waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery were common killers. The economic instability of the 14th century made planning for the future nearly impossible. Currency was unreliable, trade was disrupted by warfare, and economic systems were constantly in flux. People might work for years to accumulate modest wealth, only to lose it all in a single raid, famine, or economic collapse. There was no social safety net, no insurance, no way to protect yourself against the constant economic uncertainty. Natural disasters added another layer of misery to 14th century life. Earthquakes, floods, and storms could wipe out entire communities with no warning. The Thames froze solid multiple times during the century, disrupting trade and transportation. Volcanic eruptions in distant parts of the world affected weather patterns globally, leading to crop failures and famine even in regions that weren't directly affected by the eruptions themselves. The psychological toll of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. People lived in constant fear, fear of disease, fear of violence, fear of starvation, fear of damnation. There was no concept of mental health or psychological support. People who would today be diagnosed with depression, anxiety, or PTSD were considered either possessed by demons or suffering from an imbalance of humors. Treatment often involved exorcism, bloodletting, or other procedures that made their condition worse. The isolation of medieval life was profound. Without modern transportation or communication, people lived in small, insular communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy was non-existent, but so was the broader connection to humanity that we take for granted today. If disaster struck your community, you might never know if similar disasters were happening elsewhere. You couldn't call for help from the outside world, couldn't learn from other people's experiences, couldn't even know if you were alone in your suffering. Entertainment was limited and often crude by modern standards. Public executions were considered entertainment. Bear baiting, where dogs would attack a chained bear, was a popular spectacle. Traveling performers might occasionally visit larger towns, but for most people, entertainment meant local festivals tied to religious holidays or agricultural cycles. Even these celebrations were often overshadowed by the constant awareness of mortality and suffering. The concept of childhood as we understand it today didn't really exist in the 14th century. Children were expected to work from an early age and were often treated as small adults. Child mortality was so high that many parents couldn't afford to become emotionally attached to their children until they were old enough to have a reasonable chance of survival. Education for children was virtually non-existent outside of the nobility and clergy. Marriage and family life were shaped by economic necessity rather than love or companionship. Marriages were typically arranged to consolidate property or create political alliances. Domestic life was harsh, with multiple generations often crowded into a single room. The constant presence of death meant that families were frequently broken up by disease, warfare, or economic hardship. The justice system was arbitrary and brutal. Trial by ordeal was still practiced in some places. The idea that God would protect the innocent from harm, so if someone was burned by hot iron or drowned in water, they must be guilty. Punishments were designed to be public spectacles that would deter others from crime. The death penalty was used for a wide range of offenses, and execution methods were deliberately painful and humiliating. Superstition and ignorance shaped every aspect of life. People believed in witches, demons, and magical curses. They thought that disease was caused by bad air or divine punishment. Astrology was considered a legitimate science. Alchemists tried to turn lead into gold, while physicians prescribed treatments based on the position of the stars. The scientific method didn't exist yet, so people couldn't distinguish between effective treatments and harmful superstitions. The environmental conditions of the 14th century were also terrible. Cities were overcrowded and filthy, with human and animal waste flowing through the streets. The air was thick with smoke from fires used for heating and cooking. Rivers and water sources were contaminated with waste and industrial runoff from activities like tanning and dyeing. The smell alone would be overwhelming to someone used to modern sanitation standards. For the few people who did manage to accumulate some wealth or status, life was still precarious. Political fortunes could change overnight, leading to execution or exile. The constant warfare meant that even the wealthy lived in fear of raids or sieges. Inheritance laws were complex and often led to violent disputes. There was no banking system to speak of, so wealth had to be stored in physical form that could be stolen or destroyed. The religious climate of the 14th century added another layer of psychological pressure. The Church taught that life on earth was merely a test, with eternal damnation awaiting those who failed. The concept of purgatory meant that even good people would suffer after death. Religious authorities could declare almost any behavior sinful, creating a constant state of anxiety about one's spiritual welfare. The Great Schism, when there were multiple competing popes, shattered many people's faith and added to the general sense of chaos and uncertainty. Travel was extremely dangerous and uncomfortable. Roads were little more than dirt paths that became muddy quagmires in rain and snow. Bridges were rare and often in poor repair. Travelers faced constant threats from bandits, wild animals, and hostile locals. Inns were filthy and overcrowded when they existed at all. Most people who traveled did so on foot, carrying everything they owned on their backs. The technological limitations of the 14th century made even basic tasks exhausting and time-consuming. Without modern tools and machinery, everything had to be done by hand. Farming was backbreaking labor that yielded poor results. Manufacturing was slow and inefficient. Transportation was limited to what could be carried by humans or animals. Communication over long distances was nearly impossible, with messages taking weeks or months to travel between distant locations. As the century progressed, The cumulative effects of plague, famine, warfare, and social upheaval created a sense of apocalyptic doom. Many people believed they were living through the end times. The traditional social order was breaking down, but nothing coherent was emerging to replace it. Art and literature from the period reflect this sense of despair and uncertainty. The Dance of Death became a popular artistic theme, showing death as the great equalizer that would eventually claim everyone regardless of their status in life. The 14th century represents a perfect storm of human suffering that was unprecedented in its scope and duration. Unlike later catastrophes that were limited to specific regions or time periods, the disasters of the 14th century affected virtually everyone in the known world and lasted for generations. The combination of disease, famine, warfare, social upheaval, and environmental degradation created conditions that were truly nightmarish by any standard. What makes the 14th century particularly horrific is not just the scale of suffering, but the complete lack of hope or escape. Modern disasters, however terrible, are accompanied by the knowledge that help is available, that medical treatment exists, that governments and international organizations are mobilizing resources to help. People in the 14th century had no such comfort. They lived in a world where disaster was the norm, where suffering was expected, and where tomorrow would likely be worse than today. The psychological impact of living through such conditions is almost impossible for us to imagine. Every aspect of life was shaped by scarcity, violence, and the constant presence of death. There was no social safety net, no medical care, no hope for a better future. People watched their children die, their communities collapse, and their entire world crumble around them, with no understanding of why it was happening or any realistic hope that it would ever get better. So the next time you're having a bad day, maybe your internet is slow, or you're stuck in traffic, or you're dealing with some bureaucratic annoyance, take a moment to appreciate the incredible privilege of living in the 21st century. You have access to clean water, safe food, effective medical care, and a social system that, despite its flaws, provides basic protections and opportunities that people in the 14th century couldn't even dream of. You live in a time when a small cut won't kill you, when women can own property and choose their husbands, when knowledge is freely available, and when there's reasonable hope that tomorrow will be better than today. Let's delve deeper into some specific aspects of daily life that really illustrate just how brutal this century was. Consider, for instance, the simple act of getting dressed in the morning. For most people, clothing was incredibly limited and expensive. A peasant might own only 1 or 2 sets of clothes for their entire adult life. These garments were made from rough, scratchy materials that were uncomfortable against the skin and provided little protection from the elements. Washing clothes was an enormous undertaking that happened perhaps once or twice a year. The rest of the time, people simply wore increasingly dirty, smelly, and worn clothing. The wealthy might have more garments, but even they had to deal with fabrics that harbored lice, fleas, and other parasites. The concept of changing clothes daily, or even weekly, was completely foreign. Personal hygiene was equally challenging. Soap was expensive and often unavailable. Most people went months without a proper bath, using only cold water and rough cloths to clean themselves occasionally. Deodorant didn't exist, so the smell of unwashed bodies was constant and overwhelming. Dental care meant chewing on twigs or rough cloth, if anything at all. By middle age, most people had lost several teeth to decay, making eating difficult and painful. The work that people did was backbreaking and dangerous in ways that are hard for us to comprehend today. Farmers worked from dawn to dusk using primitive tools that required enormous physical effort. A simple task like harvesting grain meant bending over for hours, cutting each stalk by hand with a sickle. There were no machines to help, no ergonomic tools to reduce strain, no understanding of how to prevent repetitive stress injuries. Mining was perhaps one of the most dangerous occupations. Miners worked in narrow, poorly ventilated tunnels that could collapse at any moment. They used candles for light, creating fire hazards in enclosed spaces. Cave-ins were common, as were floods and toxic gas poisoning. Many miners developed lung diseases from breathing dust and particles, leading to slow, painful deaths. There were no safety regulations, no protective equipment, and no compensation for injuries or deaths. Craftsmanship and manufacturing were similarly hazardous. Blacksmiths worked with extremely hot metals without proper protection, suffering frequent burns and eye injuries from flying sparks. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals and animal waste, often developing skin diseases and respiratory problems. Dyers used poisonous substances like lead and mercury, frequently becoming ill from prolonged exposure to these materials. The economic system itself was designed to keep most people in poverty. The feudal structure meant that peasants owed a significant portion of their labor and produce to their lords. They might work 3 days a week on their lord's land for free, then struggle to maintain their own small plots in their remaining time. When harvest time came, they had to give a percentage of their crops to the lord, another percentage to the church as a tithe, and try to keep enough for their families to survive the winter. Taxes were arbitrary and crushing. Lords could impose new taxes whenever they needed money for warfare or construction projects. There was no appeals process, no representation, no way for common people to have any say in how they were governed. People might work for months to save a small amount of money, only to have it all taken in a single tax assessment. The monetary system was unreliable and constantly changing. Different regions used different currencies, making trade complicated and often unfair. Coins were frequently debased, meaning their actual precious metal content was less than their stated value. People had no way to verify the authenticity or value of money they received, leading to constant uncertainty about their actual wealth. Let's talk about the legal system in more detail, because it was truly terrifying for ordinary people. Justice was not blind in the 14th century. It was heavily weighted in favor of the wealthy and powerful. A peasant who stole bread to feed his starving family might be hanged, while a lord who murdered a peasant might pay a small fine or face no consequences at all. Trial procedures were often designed to produce predetermined outcomes. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions, and most people would eventually confess to anything to make the pain stop. The rack, thumbscrews, and the Iron Maiden were all common instruments of judicial torture. Witnesses could be bought or intimidated, and there was no concept of legal representation for the accused. Punishments were deliberately cruel and public. The stocks and pillory were used to humiliate minor offenders, forcing them to endure hours of public mockery and abuse. More serious crimes were punished by mutilation. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Liars might have their tongues removed. Executions were elaborate public spectacles designed to terrify the population into compliance. The witch trials and heresy prosecutions added another layer of terror to daily life. Anyone could be accused of witchcraft or heretical beliefs based on the flimsiest evidence, or no evidence at all. A failed crop, a sick animal, or even just being unpopular in the community could lead to accusations. Once accused, it was nearly impossible to prove innocence. The trials often involved torture, designed to extract confessions, and the punishments were inevitably death, usually by burning. Women faced particular dangers in this legal system. They could be accused of witchcraft for practicing traditional healing, for being too knowledgeable about herbs and medicine, or simply for being old and living alone. The concept of consent in sexual matters barely existed. Rape was considered a property crime against a woman's male relatives rather than a personal assault against the woman herself. The church, which was supposed to provide moral guidance and comfort, was often corrupt and oppressive. Many priests were illiterate and could barely perform their religious duties. Others used their positions to exploit their congregations sexually and financially. The sale of indulgences, essentially paying money to reduce time in purgatory, was widespread and blatantly corrupt. The Inquisition used terror tactics to suppress any deviation from Orthodox Catholic teaching. People could be tortured and executed for expressing doubts about church doctrine, for owning forbidden books, or for practicing any form of non-Catholic worship. The Spanish Inquisition, which began in the late 15th century, actually had its roots in the religious persecutions of the 14th century. Superstition and ignorance permeated every aspect of life in ways that made daily existence even more frightening. People believed that disease was caused by bad air or divine punishment, so they made no effort to improve sanitation or prevent the spread of illness. They thought that mental illness was caused by demonic possession, leading to brutal treatments that often killed the patient. Astrology was considered a legitimate science, so people made important decisions based on the positions of stars and planets. Medical treatments were often based on astrological calculations rather than any understanding of anatomy or disease. Physicians would refuse to perform surgery during certain phases of the moon, even if the patient was dying. Alchemy was pursued seriously by scholars who believed they could turn base metals into gold or discover the secret of eternal life. These pursuits, while scientifically worthless, consumed enormous resources and gave people false hope about solving their problems through magical means. The educational system, such as it was, reinforced ignorance and superstition. The few schools that existed were controlled by the church and focused on religious doctrine, rather than practical knowledge. Students were taught to memorize religious texts, rather than to think critically or question what they were told. Scientific inquiry was discouraged or forbidden if it contradicted church teaching. Books were incredibly rare and expensive, hand-copied by monks who often made errors or deliberately altered texts to conform to church doctrine. The printing press wouldn't be invented until the mid-15th century, so knowledge was tightly controlled by a small elite. Most people lived and died without ever seeing a book, let alone learning to read one. The isolation of medieval communities added another dimension to the suffering of the 14th century. Most people lived in small villages that were days or weeks of travel from the nearest town. Communication with the outside world was extremely limited, so people often had no idea what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. This isolation meant that when disaster struck, whether plague, famine, or warfare, communities were largely on their own. There was no outside help coming, no relief agencies, no government assistance. If the local harvest failed, people starved. If bandits attacked, there was no law enforcement to call for help. If disease broke out, there was no medical assistance available. The psychological impact of this isolation was profound. People lived in constant uncertainty about the wider world. They might hear rumors of disasters in distant places, but have no way to verify the information or understand what it might mean for them. This uncertainty bred anxiety and paranoia that affected every aspect of daily life. Family life in the 14th century was shaped by constant loss and hardship. Parents knew that many of their children would die before reaching adulthood, so emotional attachments were often guarded and complicated. Children who did survive were expected to contribute to the family's economic survival from a very young age, working in fields or learning trades instead of playing or going to school. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement, rather than a romantic partnership. Families would arrange marriages to consolidate property, create business partnerships, or settle debts. Love, if it developed at all, was considered a fortunate bonus, rather than a necessary foundation for marriage. Women had no say in these arrangements and were essentially transferred from their father's control to their husband's control. Domestic violence was not only tolerated, but often encouraged as a way for men to maintain discipline in their households. Women who were beaten by their husbands had no legal recourse and no safe place to go. The church taught that wives should submit to their husbands in all things, reinforcing these power imbalances. Housing conditions for most people were deplorable by any modern standard. Peasant homes were typically 1 or 2 rooms shared by entire extended families, along with their livestock. These buildings were poorly constructed, with gaps in the walls that let in cold air, rain, and snow. There was no insulation, no heating system beyond a central fire pit that filled the room with smoke. Privacy was non-existent in these crowded conditions. Multiple generations slept in the same room, often in the same bed. Personal space was unknown, and family conflicts had no private outlet. The stress of living in such close quarters, combined with the constant struggle for survival, created enormous tension within families. Sanitation in these homes was primitive at best. Human waste was often disposed of by throwing it out the window into the street. Animal waste from livestock living in the house accumulated on the floor. The smell would have been overwhelming, and disease spread rapidly in these unsanitary conditions. The food available to most people was not only limited in quantity, but poor in quality and nutritional value. The medieval diet was heavily based on bread and porridge made from whatever grains were available. Vegetables were seasonal and often scarce. Fruit was a rare luxury for special occasions. Meat was largely reserved for the wealthy, and even they had to deal with preservation challenges. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, smoked, or pickled to prevent spoilage. These preservation methods often made the meat tough, salty, and barely palatable. Much of the meat that people ate was actually offal, organs, blood, and other parts that we would consider inedible today. Food poisoning was common because there was no understanding of food safety. People ate spoiled meat, moldy grain, and contaminated vegetables because they had no choice. The spices that were available, primarily salt and sometimes herbs, were used not just for flavor, but to mask the taste of food that was going bad. Malnutrition was endemic, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and various deficiency diseases. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C was common, causing teeth to fall out and wounds to heal poorly. Rickets from lack of vitamin D caused bone deformities. Anemia from poor diet left people weak and unable to work effectively. Water quality was another constant health hazard. Rivers and wells were contaminated with human and animal waste, making waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery major killers. People knew that water could make you sick, so they often drank weak ale or watered wine instead. However, these beverages were not always available and were expensive for poor families. The brewing and winemaking processes did kill some bacteria, making these drinks safer than water, but they also meant that people, including children, were consuming alcohol throughout the day, This led to its own set of health and social problems, including alcohol dependency and impaired judgment that could be dangerous in an already hazardous environment. Climate and weather added yet another layer of hardship to 14th century life. The Little Ice Age brought unpredictable and often severe weather patterns. Winters were longer and colder than people were prepared for, leading to increased heating costs and food shortages. Summers could be either too wet, causing crops to rot in the fields, or too dry, causing drought and crop failure. People had no way to predict or prepare for extreme weather events. A sudden frost could destroy an entire harvest overnight. Flooding could wash away homes and livestock with no warning. Storms could sink ships and destroy buildings, wiping out years of work and savings in a matter of hours. The lack of weather prediction also meant that people couldn't plan their agricultural activities effectively. Farmers might plant crops only to have them destroyed by unexpected weather. They had no insurance to compensate for these losses, so a single bad weather event could mean starvation for an entire community. Transportation and communication were so limited that they added to the isolation and vulnerability of 14th century communities. Roads were little more than dirt paths that became impassable in bad weather. Bridges were rare and often poorly maintained, making river crossings dangerous or impossible. Travel was slow, expensive, and dangerous. A journey that today would take a few hours by car could take days or weeks on foot or horseback. Travelers faced constant threats from bandits, wild animals, and hostile communities that viewed strangers with suspicion. Many people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace in their entire lives. Communication over long distances was nearly impossible for ordinary people. Letters could only be sent by travelers or merchants, and there was no guarantee they would reach their destination. News of important events might take months to spread, and by the time it arrived, it was often distorted or outdated. This communication gap meant that people had no way to coordinate responses to widespread problems like plague or famine. Each community faced disasters alone, without knowledge of what others were doing, or whether help might be available elsewhere. The 14th century represents a unique convergence of disasters that created a perfect storm of human suffering. The Black Death, the Great Famine, constant warfare, social upheaval, and environmental degradation all combined to create conditions that were arguably worse than any other period in recorded history. What makes this century particularly tragic is that many of the suffering could have been prevented with knowledge and technology that would be developed in later centuries. The plague could have been controlled with basic understanding of sanitation and disease transmission. The famine could have been mitigated with better agricultural techniques and food storage methods. Much of the warfare could have been avoided with better political systems and communication. But perhaps most tragically, the social and religious systems of the time actually made the suffering worse by preventing people from taking effective action to help themselves. The feudal system kept people trapped in poverty and ignorance. The church discouraged scientific inquiry that might have led to better medical care or agricultural techniques. The legal system protected the powerful while oppressing those who might have developed solutions to common problems. The 14th century serves as a stark reminder of just how far humanity has come and how much we have to be grateful for. It was truly the worst time in human history to be alive, and every day we don't live in those conditions is a day we should count ourselves extraordinarily fortunate. The progress we've made in medicine, technology, human rights, and basic living conditions represents the accumulated wisdom and effort of countless generations who refused to accept that life had to be as brutal and short as it was in that terrible century.